The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was already a bad day for Martin Shepard, because Tuesdays in Dry Creek, Texas in the year 1882 had a way of going sideways before a man even had his second cup of coffee. He had ridden into town from the Rocking S Ranch with a list in his coat pocket, a commission from his employer old Pete Calloway to pick up a load of barbed wire and a sack of coffee beans, and whatever mail had accumulated at the general store over the past 2 weeks. It was the kind of errand that should have taken 40 minutes at most, and Martin had intended to be back before the afternoon sun made the open range feel like the inside of a Dutch oven. But old Hector at the post counter had fumbled through the wrong pigeonhole, and then fumbled through another, and by the time the man had sorted himself out and handed Martin a small canvas sack that represented Rocking S Ranch's correspondence, Martin noticed there was a letter tucked into the bundle that was addressed not to Pete Calloway, but to a man named Robert Aldridge, care of the Rocking S Ranch, Dry Creek, Palo Pinto County, Texas. Martin stood at the counter and looked at the letter a long moment. The handwriting on the envelope was a woman's, clear and careful, with a slight leftward lean that suggested she had learned to write in a school where discipline was taken seriously. The ink was dark blue, and there was a small pressed flower, a sprig of dried lavender, tucked beneath the wax seal, as if the sender had wanted to send a piece of fragrance across whatever distance separated her from the recipient. Robert Aldridge was a drifter who had worked at the Rocking S for about 6 weeks earlier in the spring, long enough to eat Pete Calloway's beef and draw 2 weeks' wages before disappearing one morning without a word. Martin had never particularly liked the man. He was the kind of fellow who told too many stories about himself, and none of them added up correctly when you thought about them afterward. Martin thanked Hector and stepped out into the harsh Texas sunlight, climbed back onto his horse biscuit, and tucked the canvas mail sack into the left saddlebag. He should have handed the letter back to Hector and told him to hold it for when Robert Aldridge came to collect it, and he knew that. But somehow the letter was in his saddlebag before he had made any conscious decision about it. The ride back to the ranch was 3 miles across open country, and the whole way Martin thought about the letter in a way that nagged at him the way a stone does when it gets lodged in a boot heel. He thought about the woman's handwriting. He thought about the dried lavender. He thought about Robert Aldridge, who had borrowed a good pair of spurs from one of the other hands before he left and had never returned them. He unsaddled Biscuit, pitched his hay, and went to his bunkhouse. He sat on the edge of his cot in the spare, plain room with its single window and its smell of saddle soap and wood smoke, and he held the letter and looked at it and tried to decide what to do. It was addressed to Robert Aldridge. It was not his business. He set it on the small, upturned crate he used as a bedside table, and told himself he would ride back into town on Saturday and have Hector send it somewhere proper. But that night he lay awake listening to the coyotes out on the flats and thinking about the dried lavender, and sometime before midnight he lit his lantern, took the letter from the crate, and opened it. He told himself later that he had opened it only to find a return address, so that someone could notify the woman that Robert Aldridge no longer worked at the Rocking S. That was a reasonable explanation, and he almost believed it. The letter was 2 pages in that same careful slanting hand, and it began, "Dear Mr. Aldridge, I hope this letter finds you well and that the Texas weather has been kinder to you than the Missouri spring has been to us. My name is Grace Graves. I am 24 years old and I live in Hannibal, Missouri, on a small farm that belonged to my parents before they passed. I am writing in answer to your advertisement in the Prairie Bride Gazette, in which you described yourself as a hardworking and God-fearing man seeking a woman of good character for the purpose of matrimony and partnership in building a life in the West. I am such a woman, or I hope I am, though I confess I am more accustomed to speaking plainly than to selling myself like a piece of livestock at auction, and so I will simply tell you who I am and let you form your own opinion." Martin read the letter straight through without stopping, sitting on the edge of his cot with the lantern throwing a warm yellow circle around him, while the dark of the Texas night pressed at the window. Grace Graves wrote about her farm, 40 acres of good bottomland along the Salt River that she had been working alone since her mother passed in 1880 and her father the year before that, both of them taken by the same fever that had swept through Hannibal and left the churchyard considerably fuller than it had been. She wrote about her younger sister Ida, who was married now and lived in Hannibal proper and checked on Grace every Sunday, and she wrote about the farm itself with a precision and a pride that told Martin she knew exactly what she was doing with the land, and she loved it even though it was hard. She wrote that she was not looking for rescue. She wrote that she was looking for a partner, for someone to stand beside rather than behind or in front of. She wrote that she supposed it was a strange way to find such a person, through an advertisement in a gazette, but that the West was full of strange arrangements, and she had always believed that the heart was less particular about method than about outcome. She closed the letter by saying that she would understand completely if he felt no connection to what she had written, and that she wished him well in either case, and that she remained sincerely, Grace Graves. Martin sat for a long time after he finished. Outside, the coyotes had gone quiet, and there was only the sound of the wind moving through the grass. He thought about Robert Aldrich, who had put an advertisement in a gazette and collected God only knew how many letters from women like Grace Graves, and then ridden off without a word to anyone. He thought about Grace Graves on her 40 acres of Missouri bottomland, working it alone, checking the post box with reasonable hope every time she rode past the Hannibal post office. He blew out the lantern and lay in the dark for a long time. By Saturday morning he had written a reply. He sat at the long table in the cookhouse before anyone else was awake, and he used Pete Calloway's good writing paper, 2 sheets of it, and he wrote the following: "Dear Miss Graves, my name is not Robert Aldrich. I must explain how this letter came to be, and I must ask your forgiveness in advance for what must seem a very peculiar introduction. I am Martin Shepard, and I am a cowhand employed at the Rocking S Ranch in Palo Pinto County, Texas. I came into possession of your letter by a combination of postal confusion, and if I am being honest, my own curiosity, which got the better of my manners. Robert Aldrich left this ranch some weeks ago without forwarding information, and I have no way to reach him, nor am I certain you would want me to after I tell you that he also left owing one of the other men here a good pair of spurs, and owing the cook $3 from a card game. He was not, in my estimation, a man of the character he described in whatever advertisement he placed. I am sorry to be the bearer of that news. I am more sorry that you spent your careful words on him. They deserved better. I am writing to you because I read your letter, which I should not have done, and because having read it I felt it was wrong to simply let it disappear into the silence of unanswered correspondence. You wrote something that has been sitting in my chest since Tuesday and I can't seem to put it down, which is that you are looking for someone to stand beside rather than behind or in front of. I have never heard it put exactly that way, and it struck me as exactly right. I am 28 years old and I have been working cattle since I was 16, and I have never had a permanent address except this bunkhouse, which is not much to offer. But I have found myself thinking about the Salt River bottomland, and the way you described it, the way the fog comes off it in the morning, the way the corn stands up in July, and I felt you deserved at least to know that someone read your words and thought they were the truest words about a life he had read in quite some time. You do not owe me a response. I have no business writing to you at all, but I wanted you to know. Respectfully yours, Martin Shepard." He folded the letter, sealed it, and rode into Dry Creek before breakfast and gave it to Hector at the post counter before he could change his mind. He rode back to the ranch in the early morning gold light with a feeling in his chest that was somewhere between relief and absolute foolishness, and he told himself that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. 3 weeks later, Hector had a letter for Martin Shepard, And when Martin saw the dark blue ink and the careful leftward slant on the envelope, he stood at the counter for a moment without moving, the way a man stands when he steps around a corner and finds something unexpected and beautiful in front of him. Dear Mr. Shepard, he read that evening on the edge of his cot with the lantern going. I will admit that your letter startled me so thoroughly that I read it 3 times before I could organize my thoughts well enough to respond. I had not expected honesty, and I had expected even less to feel grateful for it. But I am grateful. More grateful than I can properly express, because the alternative was weeks or months of waiting for a reply that would never come from a man who clearly never deserved the trouble of a single word. So thank you for telling me the truth, even though you did not have to. Now I must ask the question that seems unavoidable. You read my letter, and instead of simply informing me of the situation and wishing me well, you wrote to me yourself. I am curious about that, Mr. Shepard. I am curious about what it is that made you put pen to paper and write 2 full pages when 1 sentence would have served the practical purpose. You say that something I wrote sat in your chest since Tuesday. I have been thinking about that particular phrase since your letter arrived, because it is not a phrase that a man uses carelessly, and you do not strike me, from the evidence of your writing, as a careless man. I would like to know more about Martin Shepard of the Rocking S Ranch in Palo Pinto County, Texas, if he is willing to be known. I would like to know what he looks like when the fog comes off the creek in the morning, and what he thinks about when he is riding across open country, and whether he has ever in his life done something brave enough to surprise himself. I believe those 3 things tell a person almost everything important there is to know about another person. I remain sincerely yours, and perhaps also very curiously yours, Grace Graves. Martin read the letter 4 times. Then he sat at the long cookhouse table before dawn and wrote back. The second letter he wrote to Grace Graves was longer than the first one, and more honest, which surprised him because he had always thought of himself as a man of few words who kept his own counsel. He had grown up in the hill country of central Texas, the youngest of 4 boys. His mother, a quiet, serious woman who had taught him to read from the family Bible, and his father, a rancher, who measured worth in the straightness of a fence line and the condition of a man's boots. He had left home at 16, when the ranch could not support all 4 boys, and he had gone north and worked cattle, and drifted through 5 counties in 4 years before Pete Calloway had taken him on at the Rocking S, and given him a permanent bunk and steady wages, and a kind of rough belonging that Martin had not fully recognized as belonging until now, writing about it to a woman in Missouri who had asked the exact right questions. He told her what he looked like when the fog came off the creek in the morning, which was not very different from what he looked like the rest of the time. A man who stood a little over 6 feet with dark hair that needed cutting and hands that were permanently roughened from rope work and cold water, though he added that he had been told his eyes were not an unpleasant feature, being a particular shade of gray-green that one of Pete Calloway's daughters had once described as the color of a Texas cedar in winter, which he had found a flattering if peculiar comparison. He told her that when he was riding across open country, he mostly thought about the grass and whether the cattle were eating well, but sometimes he thought about what lay over the next hill, not in any specific way, just the general human habit of looking at a horizon and wondering. He told her about the brave thing that had surprised him, which had happened when he was 23, and a fire broke out in the stable at night, and he had gone in 3 times to lead horses out before anyone else was awake enough to stop him. And afterward, when Pete Calloway had shaken his hand and said he was a damned fool, Martin had felt proud and terrified in almost equal measure. He told her he was not a man of particular means. He told her he was a man of reasonable character and absolute honesty, or at least absolute honesty now that he had made the error of opening a letter that was not addressed to him, and could no longer claim any moral high ground from which to be otherwise. He asked her what the Missouri summer sounded like at night. He gave the letter to Hector on Saturday and told himself again that was probably the end of it. The third letter from Grace Graves arrived on a morning in late July when the heat on the Palo Pinto Range was the kind that made the air above the ground shimmer like a disturbed reflection on water. And Martin Shepard, who was fixing a section of fence line 2 miles from the bunkhouse, and sweating through his shirt in a way that was somewhat diminishing to his dignity, rode back to the ranch at noon and found the letter waiting in the mail pile that Hector's boy had brought out on Wednesday. And he held it in his hands and felt something that he recognized clearly enough to be alarmed by. He had spent the 3 weeks since his second letter trying to put Grace Graves in the proper mental compartment, which was the compartment marked curiosity and correspondence, a thing that was pleasant and interesting but not serious, not something a working cowhand with a bunkhouse and no land should be building hopes around. He had done a reasonable job of this for about the first week, and then his mind had started slipping out of the compartment like a dog that had learned how to open a gate. He read the third letter in the shade of the water trough with his hat pushed back and the sweat cooling on his neck. "Dear Martin," she wrote, and the drop of the formal Mr. Shepard sat in his chest like a warm coal. "I have decided that continuing to call you Mr. Shepard when I know the color of your eyes and the story of the burning stable seems unnecessary and a little absurd. I hope you will permit Grace in return." "The Missouri summer sounds like this," she wrote, and then she spent half a page describing it with such specificity and such evident love that Martin could close his eyes and hear the cicadas and the bullfrogs, and the particular sound the corn makes in a night breeze when it is fully tasseled, and the whole field of it is whispering together. She described the way the Salt River looked at dusk when the light went orange across it, and how she would sometimes stop whatever she was doing and just stand at the fence rail and look at it, because her mother had always said that a woman who forgot to look at beautiful things was a woman who had let the farm own her instead of the other way around. She told him she had been thinking about what he said about looking at a horizon and wondering. She said she had been doing a lot of that herself lately. She said the horizon she had been looking at lately was not the one to the east, over the river, where the Missouri hills rose up familiar and known, but the one to the southwest, which in her geography led eventually to Texas. And she had found that a disorienting thing to notice about herself, because she was a woman who had spent her whole life with her boots planted very firmly in the Missouri bottomland, and she had never before felt a particular pull in any other direction. She was not making a proposal, she wrote. She wanted to be very clear about that. She was simply being honest in the way he had been honest with her, and she thought honesty was the thing they had established as the primary feature of this correspondence, and she did not want to abandon it now that it was becoming interesting. She told him she had told her sister Ida about the letters. She wrote that Ida had sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and listened to the whole story, beginning with the advertisement in the Prairie Bride Gazette, and the letter she had sent, and the letter from a cowhand named Martin Shepard who had opened it by mistake, and then written to her anyway. And at the end of it, Ida had put down her cup and looked at Grace with an expression that Grace described as the look of a woman who is deciding whether to say a sensible thing or an honest thing. She chose the honest thing, which was that Grace Graves had been alone on that farm for 2 years, and she had managed it beautifully, and she was one of the strongest women Ida had ever known. But that strength was not the same as not wanting someone, and that the fact that Grace had kept 3 letters from a stranger and read them until the folds were wearing soft meant something. And that Grace should not let practicality be the wall she hid behind when what she was really feeling was something considerably warmer than practical. "I am sharing this," Grace wrote, "because I have found that when my sister Ida says a true thing I feel the need to pass it along. She is usually right. I am not certain what to do with the truth in this particular case, but I thought you should know it." She closed the letter by saying that she had a question, one important question, and she would ask it directly because she had no patience for circling around important things. She asked, "Martin Shepard, if I were to write to you once more, and if that letter were to suggest that perhaps a woman from Missouri and a cowhand from Texas might find some way to be in the same place at the same time, so that they might determine whether the thing that exists between these pages also exists in actual physical proximity, would you answer yes, or would you answer no? She signed it, yours, if you want to be, Grace. Martin Shepard sat in the shade of the water trough on a 100-degree Texas afternoon with a letter from a woman in Missouri, and his heart doing things that a man of 28 who had always thought of himself as steady and practical was not entirely prepared for. He sat there for a long time. Then he went to find Pete Calloway. Pete Calloway was 62 years old and had been ranching in Palo Pinto County since 1858 and had seen most things. He was a broad, weathered man with white side whiskers and the permanently squinted eyes of someone who had spent 4 decades looking into a western sun. He was in the barn when Martin found him, working on a bridle with the calm patience of a man who understood that most things worth doing required time and steady hands. Martin stood in the barn doorway and said he needed to talk to Pete about something that was not cattle business. Pete did not look up from the bridle. He said that Martin had better come in out of the sun then and sit down, because a man who wanted to talk about something that was not cattle business generally needed to be comfortable. Martin sat on a bale of hay and told Pete the whole story, beginning with the letter in the mail sack and ending with the question at the end of Grace Graves's 3rd letter. And when he was finished, Pete set down the bridle and looked at him for a long moment with those squinted eyes. Pete said that Martin was asking permission to take some time. Martin said he supposed he was, though he did not know yet exactly what he was taking the time for. Pete said that in his experience, when a man who never talked about women suddenly talked about a specific woman for a solid 15 minutes without stopping, the man generally knew exactly what he was taking the time for. He just hadn't admitted it to himself yet. Martin looked at his boots. Pete said he could take a week in August, when the cattle work was lightest, and that if he needed 2 weeks Pete would manage, but that Martin owed him 2 weeks of extra fence work in September and they would call it square. Martin said that was more than fair. Pete picked up the bridle again and said one more thing. He said that a woman who asked a direct question deserved a direct answer, and that in his experience, the men who lost the best women in their lives were the men who hedged their answers when they should have been clear. Martin rode back into Dry Creek the next morning and wrote the 4th letter, which was the shortest he had sent and the most important. He wrote, "Dear Grace, the answer is yes." My answer was yes from the 3rd line of your 1st letter, which I had no business reading and cannot regret reading for a single moment. I would like to propose that I come to Hannibal, Missouri in August, if that is agreeable to you, because I have never in my life been to Missouri and the Salt River sounds like something worth seeing, and because I believe that the time for writing letters back and forth is over, and the time for standing in the same place has arrived. I will understand if you think this is too fast or too forward or simply too much of a gamble on the strength of 4 letters between strangers. But if you are willing, I would like to find out whether what exists on these pages is real. I believe it is. I have believed it since Tuesday. Yours, Martin. He gave the letter to Hector and went back to the Rocking S and spent 3 weeks being extremely focused on cattle and fence lines, and not thinking about whether Grace Graves would write back. She wrote back in 11 days. The letter was short. It said, "Martin Shepard, I will meet you at the Hannibal station on the 15th of August. I will be the woman on the platform wearing a green dress and an expression that is somewhere between excitement and absolute terror. Yours, Grace." Martin Shepard had never been on a train for more than 2 hours in his life, and the journey from the nearest point he could reach in Texas to Hannibal, Missouri, required 3 days and 2 transfers, and a stretch of track through the Missouri River bottoms that the conductor seemed personally uncertain about. But Martin had a good hat and the letters in his breast pocket, and a determination that had been building since July, and he watched the landscape change outside the window from the brown and gold of Texas to the deeper, lusher green of Missouri with a kind of attention he usually only gave to things that mattered. He arrived at Hannibal Station on the morning of the 15th of August, 1882, and stepped onto the platform into the thick Missouri summer heat, which was a different kind of heat than Texas, wetter and more enveloping, and he stood with his bag at his feet and looked along the platform. She was standing at the far end. Green dress. Dark hair pinned up under a small straw hat with a green ribbon. She was taller than he had somehow imagined, with a direct way of standing that matched her direct way of writing, her weight balanced evenly on both feet, no tilting or leaning, just planted there the way someone stood who was accustomed to standing their own ground. She saw him at almost the same moment, because he was the tallest man on the platform and had the look of someone who had traveled a long way and was looking for something specific. They walked toward each other across the platform through the steam and the noise and the general chaos of a railway station on a Tuesday morning, and when they were close enough to speak they both stopped and looked at each other in silence for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Grace said, "You have the eyes of a Texas cedar in winter." Martin said, "You told me that was a peculiar comparison." Grace said, "It is. It is also accurate." She extended her hand and he shook it, and they held the handshake a beat longer than a formal greeting required, and then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that rearranged the furniture in a man's chest. She took him to the farm in a wagon she had driven herself, a practical bay mare pulling it along a road that wound down from town toward the river bottom. They talked the whole way, easily, in the way of people who have already done most of their formal introduction and can get directly to the business of actually knowing each other. She asked him about the train journey. He told her about the cattle in the cars 2 trains ahead, which had objected loudly to the motion for the first 100 miles. She laughed, and the laugh was open and unguarded, and it was the best thing he had heard in a long time. The farm was everything she had described and more. The house was small but solid, white-painted clapboard with a porch along the front where a row of clay pots grew herbs and one ambitious rose bush had wound itself up a post. The fields beyond were corn, standing 8 feet tall and tasseled, exactly as she had described it, the whole field of it shifting in the breeze with that dry whisper. The river at the bottom of the pasture caught the afternoon light. Grace showed him around with a pride that was quiet and entirely earned. She showed him the kitchen garden, the root cellar, the chicken coop, the small dairy barn where 2 cows stood in amiable boredom. She showed him the fence line along the east field that she had repaired herself last spring after a neighbor's cattle had pushed through it. She pointed out where the drainage got bad in wet years and what she had done about it, which was intelligent and practical, and showed the kind of accumulated knowledge that came from years of close attention to a piece of land. Martin walked beside her and listened and looked and felt something happening to him that he did not have an immediate name for, though it was in the general family of words like home and right and yes. Her sister Ida and Ida's husband Daniel came for supper that evening, and it was a good supper: roast chicken and biscuits and 3 kinds of vegetables from the kitchen garden, and they sat around the table in the warm lamplight and talked until well past dark. Ida was a few years younger than Grace and looked enough like her to confirm they were sisters, but with a rounder face and a quicker laugh, and she watched Martin with bright, assessing eyes all through the meal in a way that was not unfriendly but was very thorough. Daniel was a quiet, steady man who worked at the mill and who shook Martin's hand at the beginning of the evening, and said he'd heard a lot about him in the past few weeks, which Martin noted meant Grace had been talking about him to her sister's household, which he found encouraging. After Ida and Daniel had gone home and the supper things were washed and put away, Martin and Grace sat on the porch in the dark with 2 cups of coffee, and the Missouri night was exactly as she had described it in the letter: the cicadas and the bullfrogs and the faint sound of the river somewhere below them, and they sat in comfortable quiet for a while, and then Martin said, "It's exactly right." Grace said what was exactly right. He said, "The sound of it. You described it, and now I'm sitting in it, and it's exactly the way you said." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had never described that to anyone before. That it had seemed too particular, too much the kind of thing that only mattered to her, and she had been surprised to find it in the letter, that description of her summer nights, and more surprised that he had asked for it. Martin said that was because everything she wrote mattered. He said he wanted her to know that. He said he had reread every letter she had sent him at least 4 times each, and that he did not think he was a sentimental man, but he had kept them all, and they were in his breast pocket right now. All 3 of them, which he was only telling her because Pete Calloway had told him that direct answers were worth more than circled ones. Grace turned to look at him in the dark, and she said, "Martin Shepard, did you ride a train for 3 days to come tell me you kept my letters?" He said he supposed he had, and then he said that he had also come because he thought that whatever this was between them, it was real and it deserved a chance. And he thought she deserved someone who would show up, actually show up, not just write nice things from a long distance. There was another silence, and then Grace said softly that when she had written that advertisement in the Prairie Bride Gazette, she had not been looking for love, not precisely. She had been looking for a practical solution to the practical problem of working a farm alone. She said she had thought love was something that came after, something that grew slowly from shared work and shared time, if you were lucky. She had not expected to find it in letters. She had not expected to find anything like what she was feeling right now, sitting on her porch in the dark with a man she had known for 10 hours in person and 4 months in ink, feeling as though she had known him all her life. Martin reached across and took her hand where it was resting on the arm of the chair. She turned her hand over and held his. Neither of them said anything for a while, and the Missouri summer sang its full chorus around them. He stayed for 8 days. Those 8 days had the particular quality of time that feels simultaneously endless and desperately short. In the mornings he helped with the farm work, not out of any obligation, but because it was his natural instinct when there was work that needed doing. He fixed the section of fence along the south pasture that Grace had been planning to get to before autumn. He helped her turn the hay in the upper field. He sat with her in the evenings on the porch, and they talked about everything: his Texas boyhood and her Missouri one, his 4 brothers and her sister Ida, what they believed in and what they doubted, what they were afraid of and what they wanted. He told her he wanted a piece of land. He had been saving wages for 8 years with a kind of general intention but no specific plan, and he had enough now for a start, enough for maybe 60 or 80 acres somewhere if the land was reasonable, and a man could negotiate. He said he had been thinking about New Mexico territory or maybe the Texas Panhandle, where land was still affordable and the cattle range was good. Grace listened to this with her serious, direct attention, and then she said a thing that surprised him. She said, "Have you thought about Missouri?" He looked at her. She said, "The farm next to mine, Mr. Ellison's place, has been empty for a year. The man was a bachelor and he had no family to inherit it, and his estate has been sitting with the county trying to find a buyer. 80 acres of decent bottomland, a small house that wants work but has good bones, outbuildings that are in fair shape. It went for back taxes last year, and the county is asking less than the land is worth, because they want someone on it who will work it and pay taxes." Martin was quiet for a long moment. She said she was not trying to rush anything or make any assumptions. She was simply presenting information because she was a woman who presented relevant information when she had it. He looked at the dark fields and the line of the river and the sky full of Missouri stars, which were not so different from Texas stars when you came right down to it, just in slightly different positions. He said, "Grace." She said, "Yes." He said, "I need to go back to Texas and finish out my obligations to Pete Calloway and collect my savings from where I've got them and give proper notice. That will take me some time. maybe 6 weeks. But I would like, before I leave, to have a clear understanding between us about what I'm coming back to. Because I'm not a man who does things halfway, and I'm not coming back to Hannibal, Missouri, to see whether things might possibly develop, not at this point. If I come back, I'm coming back to court you properly and directly, and if that goes the way I believe it will go, I'm coming back to stay." Grace looked at him for a long, steady moment, and then she said, "That is a direct answer, Martin Shepard." He said he had been told they were worth more. She said, "Go back to Texas. Finish what you need to finish. And yes, I will be here." The goodbye on the platform 8 days after the hello was harder than either of them found comfortable to admit. They stood by the train with her hand in both of his, and the steam building up around the engine, and the conductor calling the first boarding. And Grace looked up at him with those clear, direct eyes, and said that she was going to go home and write him a letter that evening because she found she could not stop even now that she had the real version right in front of her. And Martin said that was probably good because he was fairly certain he was going to spend the whole 3-day train ride composing the next one in his head. She stood on the platform and watched the train until it was gone. He sat in his car with his head leaned against the window, and the Missouri countryside sliding past, and thought about 8 days and a porch in the dark, and a woman who fixed her own fence lines, and described summer nights with the precision of someone who loved what she was describing. And he thought about what it would mean to make a home, a real permanent home, not just a bunkhouse and a steady wage, but land and a house and a life that was his own. He thought about it all the way to Texas. He was back at the Rocking S by the 28th of August. Pete Calloway heard him out over supper in the main house, with the whole story this time, including the 8 days in Hannibal and the Ellison farm next door to Grace's place and the savings and the plan. And when Martin was finished, Pete looked at the table for a while, and then he looked at Martin. Pete said, "You've been at the Rocking S for 8 years. Martin said he had. Pete said he had been thinking for some time that he needed a foreman more than he needed another cowhand, and that he had been paying Martin cowhand wages when Martin was doing foreman's work, and that he could increase those wages by 1/3 for Martin's last 6 weeks if Martin would train up young Billy Dawes to take on the additional responsibilities before he left. Martin said that was not necessary. Pete said it was necessary to him, because Pete Calloway was a man who kept his accounts straight, and he had been in Martin's debt on that score for the better part of 2 years. He put out his hand and Martin shook it, and they understood each other completely in the way of men who had worked beside each other for 8 years and did not require many words to do it. The 6 weeks were busy. Martin trained Billy Dawes, who was 22 and eager and smarter than he looked, and he worked the September fence line he owed Pete, and he sent letters to Grace every 10 days or so, and received hers in return, and they were different now from the early letters. Warmer, more specific, more like two people who had looked at each other in person and found the looking good, and were now talking as people do when they have moved past the introduction. Grace wrote about the county agent who was helping her manage the inquiries about the Ellison property, and about the house, which she had gone over carefully, and reported that the chimney needed repointing, and one of the floor joists was soft but the rest was sound, and that the well was deep and clean. She wrote these things in the same tone she wrote about missing him in the evenings on the porch, practical and warm simultaneously, and Martin found that combination more appealing than he could easily express. He settled his wages at the Rocking S, said his goodbyes to the bunkhouse, and on the 3rd of October loaded Biscuit into a livestock car and himself into a passenger car and headed north. He arrived in Hannibal on a Sunday morning with 2 bags, a horse, his 8 years of savings in a locked box, and a ring that he had bought in Waco from a jeweler on the main street, a simple gold band with a small garnet set in it, because the jeweler had told him garnet was a stone for constancy, and Martin had thought that was exactly right. Grace met him at the station in the green dress again, which he noted and told her he noted. She said she had worn it because it had worked the first time. This time, there was no formal handshake. She simply walked to him when he stepped off the platform, and they held each other for a long moment with his bags on the ground around them, and Biscuit's indignant presence adding a certain practical urgency to the reunion. He met with the county land agent on Monday morning with Grace beside him at the table. The Ellison property was 83 acres of bottomland at a price that made sense for a man with 8 years of careful savings, and he signed the papers that afternoon with his jaw set and his hand steady. And when it was done, he owned 83 acres of Missouri bottomland, and a house that needed work and a life that was finally a specific shape instead of a general intention. The house needed more work than the 8 weeks before winter would fully permit. But between Martin's labor and Daniel from the mill bringing over good lumber and 2 of Grace's neighboring farmers who came one Saturday in October with their tools and their wives and spent the whole day working on the place in the cooperative tradition of that kind of country community, the essential work was done. The chimney was repointed, the soft joist was replaced, the porch boards were renewed, the roof was sound. Martin moved in on a Friday evening with a cot and a stove and a lantern, and the locked box and Biscuit in the new-cleaned barn, and it was the first night in 28 years that he had gone to sleep in a place that belonged to him. He did not wait as long as he had originally planned to propose. He had planned to wait until spring, thinking that was a reasonable courtship timeline, and that he did not want to rush her. But one evening in late October when they were sitting at her kitchen table after supper working through her account books together, because she had asked for a second set of eyes and he had a reasonable head for figures. He looked up from the ledger and she was watching him with an expression that he recognized because he had seen it in the summer on the porch, that open, unguarded look that she did not seem to know she was wearing. He closed the ledger. She said, "What?" he said. "I have a question." And he put his hand in his coat pocket and brought out the ring, still in the small cloth the jeweler had wrapped it in, and he set it on the table between the ledger and the lamp. Grace looked at the cloth for a long moment and then she looked at him. He said, "I know it has been a very rapid progression from a misdelivered letter to this kitchen table. I know that. And I know that you are a woman who does not make decisions lightly and that you have 40 acres of your own and you do not need me for practical reasons and you know your own mind better than most people know theirs. So I am asking you, not assuming. Will you marry me, Grace Graves? Not because a farm needs a second pair of hands, and not because letters have been going back and forth, but because I am absolutely and completely certain that you are the person I want to be beside, in the way you described it, not behind or in front of, just beside, for the rest of my life." Grace looked at him for a long, steady moment, and then she reached across the table and picked up the cloth and unwrapped the ring and held it up in the lamplight and looked at the small garnet, which glowed like a coal in the warm light. She said, "Garnet is a stone for constancy." He said, "I know." She said, "How did you know that?" He said the jeweler in Waco told him and he thought it was exactly right. Grace turned the ring in the light once more and then she looked at him and her eyes were bright in the way that was not sadness but was something more complicated and more complete, and she said, "Yes, Martin Shepard. Of course the answer is yes." He put the ring on her finger and she came around the table and he stood up, and they held each other in the warm lamplight of her kitchen with the Missouri October pressing cold and dark at the windows. And it was one of those moments that a person knows, even while they are inside it, that it is a moment they will keep. They were married in the Hannibal Church on the 22nd of November, 1882, which was 3 days before Thanksgiving, which Grace said was intentional because she could not think of a better thing to be thankful for than getting the timing right. The ceremony was small by choice. Just Ida and Daniel and their small daughter Emma, and a few of the neighboring farm families who had helped with the housework, and Pete Calloway, who had made the train journey up from Texas because Martin had written to him and Pete had said if Martin thought he was getting married in Missouri without Pete Calloway in attendance, then Martin had seriously misjudged the situation. Pete sat in the front pew in a suit that had clearly been purchased some years ago for formal occasions and not worn frequently since. And he watched the ceremony with his white side whiskers and his squinted eyes. And when Martin turned from the altar with Grace's hand in his, Pete nodded once in the particular way of a man who had said a thing was going to happen exactly this way, and was satisfied to have been right. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a working winter, both of them at it, managing her farm and getting his ground ready for spring, learning to operate as what they were now, a unit, two farms that were in practice one household even though the properties were technically separate. The Ellison house, Martin's house, was where they lived. Grace's house they made into their working farmhouse, the center of the operation, because hers was older and set better on the property, and had the deep-root cellar she had spent years provisioning. Martin learned Missouri farming, which had its own rhythms and requirements, different from Texas ranching in almost every respect. But the fundamental principles of reading land and reading weather and reading a season were things he had learned young, and they applied well enough. Grace learned to appreciate that a man who had worked cattle across 5 Texas counties had a particular kind of practical intelligence and physical confidence about outdoor work that was useful in ways she had not fully anticipated. They learned each other through the doing of things, which is in many ways the most complete way to learn a person. They had their first real argument in January over the question of whether to plant a particular field in corn again or try sorghum, which was not a dramatic or especially interesting argument as arguments go, but which taught Martin that Grace Graves Shepard, as she now was, did not back down from a position she had thought through carefully, and taught Grace that Martin listened better than most men she had known, actually listened, and could change his position when a good argument was made. They planted sorghum in that field. It did well. By February she was carrying their first child, which she told him on a cold morning in the kitchen with the snow coming down outside and the stove hot, and both of them eating breakfast with the particular efficiency of farmers who did not waste morning time. And she said it quietly between pouring the coffee and sitting down. And Martin set down his cup and looked at her, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and held her face in his roughened hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes go bright again in that complete way. And then he sat back down and she poured his coffee and they finished breakfast. But the whole of the morning had changed. The kitchen was different. The snow coming down was different. Everything was illuminated from some interior source. He wrote to Pete Calloway that week. Pete wrote back and said he was glad to hear it and that Martin should teach the child to respect a fence line from the beginning and everything else would follow. Grace's sister Ida came frequently through the spring, and her presence was a comfort and a delight to both of them, because Ida was good company and genuinely happy for her sister, and regarded Martin with the warm approval of someone who had watched Grace work that farm alone for 2 years, and had wanted better for her and now had the satisfaction of seeing better arrive. She brought vegetables from her kitchen garden and opinions on everything, freely offered and mostly useful. The spring planting went well. The sorghum field was prepared and seeded. The corn went in May, with Martin running the plow and Grace directing operations from practical knowledge of what each section of ground needed. They acquired 2 more cows for the dairy and 4 pigs, and Martin built a proper henhouse that was more substantial than the previous one, which had been allowing nocturnal losses that Grace had been managing with a sense of resigned frustration for 2 years. In the evenings they sat on the porch of the farmhouse, both of them tired in the complete physical way of people who have worked hard with their bodies all day. And they talked or they did not talk and were comfortable in both modes. And sometimes Martin would bring out one of the letters, one of the original ones, and read a piece of it aloud, and Grace would listen with a smile that was private and warm. He told her once on a June evening that he still thought the 3rd letter was the bravest thing he had ever read. She said, I was terrified when I wrote it. He said he knew. He could tell. That was what made it brave." She leaned against his shoulder on the porch bench, and the Missouri summer sang around them, and the corn was tall in the field below, and she said she was glad he had opened a letter that was not addressed to him. He said he was too. He said he had been grateful to Robert Aldrich for the first and last time in his life. Grace laughed, and it was still the open, unguarded laugh, and it was still the best thing he heard on any given day. The summer of 1883 was the fullest one Martin Shepard had yet lived, not the hardest or the busiest, though it was both of those things, but the fullest in the sense of a life that had all of its elements present and properly arranged. The crops came in well. The cattle were healthy. The farmstead had the purposeful, well-tended look of a place that was being properly cared for by people who knew what they were doing and cared about doing it right. Neighbors stopped by with the regularity of people in a rural community who check on each other as a matter of habit and genuine interest. And Martin, who had spent 8 years as a bunkhouse hand with the particular kind of transient, social but shallow belonging of hired men, found that the kind of belonging that came from owning a piece of ground and being known in a community was a different and considerably deeper thing. He had written the letter to Robert Aldrich, or rather to whoever might be occupying Robert Aldrich's current whereabouts, sometime in the spring, because it had seemed like a thing that needed doing. Not an angry letter, not an accusatory one. A practical one, saying simply that there was a woman named Grace Graves in Hannibal, Missouri, who had written him an honest letter and deserved an honest acknowledgement, and that Martin Shepard had opened that letter by mistake and had found it so fine and its author so remarkable that he had married her, and that he hoped Mr. Aldrich was somewhere that suited him, but that he wanted him to know he had lost something worth considerably more than a pair of borrowed spurs. He did not expect a response and did not receive one, which was entirely appropriate. The boy was born on the 8th of September, 1883, on a Sunday morning with Ida and the local midwife both present and Martin in the kitchen being systematically unhelpful, until Ida came out and told him to go do something useful outside, and he went and fixed a section of fence that did not especially need fixing, but needed his hands on something constructive. When Ida came to get him and he came in, and Grace was in the bed with the baby and her dark hair spread out, and her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear, and that direct look on them, Martin stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a moment, and felt something that exceeded the vocabulary he had available for it. The boy had Grace's dark hair and Martin's gray-green eyes, and a considerable amount of opinions about the general situation, which he expressed at volume. Martin sat on the edge of the bed and held his son for the first time and looked down at the face, so new and so specifically itself, and Grace watched him from the pillow with a quiet smile. He said, "He's remarkable." She said, "He is. We should give him a good name." They named him Samuel after Martin's father, with James for Grace's father as a middle name, and the combination of Samuel James Shepard was written in the family Bible that evening by Martin's hand, under Martin and Grace's own marriage entry, in the same careful way he had watched his own mother write in the family Bible when he was very young, with the understanding that this was the record, this was the permanence, these pages. Samuel James Shepard grew from an opinionated infant into an opinionated boy with startling efficiency, as small children tend to do, and the farm expanded around him to accommodate the expansion of the family. By the summer of 1885, Grace was carrying their second child, which she told Martin while they were both in the vegetable garden pulling weeds in the morning heat, just mentioned it as if it were part of the ongoing conversation they were perpetually having, and Martin sat back on his heels in the dirt between 2 rows of bean plants and looked at her, and then he said that they were going to need to talk about expanding the house. She said she had been thinking the same thing. The second child was a daughter, born in February of 1886 and named Clara, who came into the world with the calm equanimity of a person who had decided in advance to make no particular fuss about the whole business. Where Samuel announced his presence with conviction, Clara observed the world with wide gray-green eyes and a contemplative quiet that she retained through her infancy and into childhood, though it turned out to be the quiet of someone who was thinking rather than the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. Pete Calloway made a second trip to Hannibal in the spring of 1886. This one a longer stay, 2 weeks, because he was 66 years old, and the rocking S was running without him now, and his hips were not what they had been, and he had decided he wanted to see the Missouri country, and he had the absolute prerogative of an old man who had earned his choices. He sat on the porch with Martin in the evenings and met the children and ate Grace's cooking and declared with the authority of a man who had seen a great many households that this was a good one, and that Martin had been the second biggest fool he had ever encountered for waiting until he was 28 to get started, the first biggest fool being himself, Pete Calloway, who had let the only woman he had ever truly loved leave Missouri for Oregon 30 years ago because he had been too young and too proud to tell her what he was feeling. Martin looked at him when he said that. Pete said, "Do not look at me like that. I am simply illustrating the value of directness, which I told you about years ago." Martin said, "You did. I took your advice." Pete said, "I know you did. I have been taking satisfaction from that fact for 4 years." He went back to Texas in May with a new ease about him that Martin noticed and was glad to see. Pete Calloway had come to Hannibal carrying something he had needed to put down, and the farm and the children and Grace's table had helped him put it down, whatever it was, and he left lighter. The years moved the way good years do, with the weight of work and weather and growth and loss and ordinary joy. There were hard seasons, a drought in 1887 that made the corn come in thin and required careful management of what they had, a wet spring in 1888 that flooded the lower pasture and kept it useless for 2 months. Martin dealt with these things the way he dealt with everything, with steady practical attention and without drama, and Grace dealt with them the same way, and they met each difficult season as they met everything, standing beside each other. Samuel started school in the fall of 1888, riding a pony into Hannibal 3 times a week with the Larson children from down the road, returning in the afternoons with the satisfied and slightly chaotic energy of a 5-year-old who has spent a day learning things and needs to tell someone all of them immediately. Clara by this time was 2, and in the serious business of learning to walk and talk simultaneously, which she conducted with a methodical determination that made both her parents privately laugh. In the winter of 1888, Martin received a letter from his brother Thomas in Texas, the brother closest to him in age, saying that their parents were aging, and the home ranch in the hill country was struggling and asking if Martin had any thoughts. Martin talked it over with Grace that evening for a long time, going through what they could spare and what made sense and what was right. And they sent money, a reasonable sum from their savings, enough to put the home ranch on steadier ground for a season or 2 and allow Martin's parents to hire some additional help. He wrote to Thomas with the plan, and Thomas wrote back with a gratitude that was brief and genuine, because the Shepard men were not demonstrative in their writing, but the meaning came through. Martin's mother wrote to Grace, a separate letter, personal, and Grace wrote back, and they began a correspondence that was in some ways an echo of the original correspondence that had started everything. 2 women writing across distance in clear and honest language, and Martin would sometimes catch Grace at the kitchen table writing to his mother and feel a warmth at it that was almost too much to look at directly. Pete Calloway died in the winter of 1890. Peacefully, in his sleep at the rocking S, which was exactly the kind of death a man like Pete would have wanted, and which Martin received via telegram at the Hannibal post office on a January afternoon and rode home with in his coat pocket, not opening it until he was in the kitchen with Grace. She watched him read it and then came to him and held him without a word, because there was nothing to say that was better than that. And Martin held on for a while and was grateful for the particular grace, both the general kind and the specific woman, of not having to be alone in a moment that required not being alone. He went to the funeral in Texas, making the train journey with a heaviness in his chest, and arriving at Dry Creek to find that Pete Calloway had left him something in the will, not land or money, which had gone to the nephew who now ran the Rocking S. But the bridle, the one Pete had been working on that day in the barn when Martin had come to ask for time to go to Missouri. And a letter that Pete had apparently written some time before his death and given to the Dry Creek attorney with instructions for its delivery. The letter said, "Martin, you were the best hand the Rocking S ever had, which you know. What you may not know is that you were also the best advertisement I ever saw for the proposition that a man's life can be changed by a thing as small as a misdirected letter if he is brave enough to do something about it. I have been thinking about that Oregon woman less bitterly in recent years. I credit you and your grace for that. Keep the fence line straight. Pete." Martin folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket and rode the train back to Missouri carrying the bridle and his grief and a feeling of continuation, of things being properly passed forward. By the spring of 1891, the farm was thriving and their household was full, and they had added to it, with the help of 2 hired men for the busier seasons, a young pair of brothers named William and George Yates from a family in the next county who needed work, and who turned out to be exactly the kind of young men who benefited from being around a steady operation, and a couple who treated them like people rather than labor. Martin taught them what he knew about cattle, and Grace taught them what she knew about the land, and they learned. Samuel, 8 years old by now, was in the way of boys that age completely convinced that he was a grown man and needed to be involved in all adult activities, and he followed Martin and the Yates brothers around the farm with a serious commitment that was more charming than useful, but was nonetheless welcomed. Clara at 5 was a quieter presence who had developed a particular affinity for the kitchen garden, which she tended with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and would deliver reports to Grace on the progress of various vegetables with the gravity of a field general assessing troop readiness. Martin had kept all of the original letters, all of them, hers and his, in a small cedar box that lived in the top drawer of the dresser in their bedroom. He had not spoken much about the box to Grace after the early years. It was simply there, a known thing, but one evening in the summer of 1891, when both children were asleep and the evening was warm and they were on the porch together in the dark, she said she had been thinking about the letters. He waited. She said that she had been thinking specifically about the first letter, the one she had sent to Robert Aldrich, and how she had written it with a particular careful hopefulness that she recognized now, looking back, was the hopefulness of someone who wanted something specific but was not sure it existed, not sure if what she was describing, a person to stand beside, was actually available or whether she was describing something she had invented out of her own need. Martin said, "It was available." She said, "It was. You answered a letter that was not addressed to you, and I have been grateful for that error every day for 9 years." He took her hand on the porch bench, the same way he had taken it on that first summer night in this same spot, and she turned it over and held his the same way. He said, "I have been thinking about writing a letter to the Prairie Bride Gazette." She looked at him. He said, "A letter saying that in August of 1882, a man named Martin Shepard opened a letter that was addressed to a man named Robert Aldrich at the Rocking S Ranch in Dry Creek, Texas, and that by the third letter from the woman who had written it, Martin Shepard was absolutely incapable of stopping, and that the appropriate and entirely predictable result was a farm in Missouri and a cedar box full of correspondence and 2 children, and a life that was better than anything he had thought to hope for when he was a cowhand in a Texas bunkhouse with a general intention and no specific plan. Grace was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Who would you send that letter to?" He said he supposed he would send it to Robert Aldridge, wherever the man was, as a final accounting. She laughed, her open laugh, and leaned against his shoulder, and they sat in the summer dark while Hannibal went quiet around them, and the river made its sound below the pasture, and the corn stood tall in the field, and the farm breathed around them in the warm July night. The years that followed deepened everything without changing its essential quality. Samuel grew into a boy of 12, 13, 14, the years going quickly in the way they do when you are watching someone become themselves, and the particular person he was becoming was one who had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and a gift for numbers that he had apparently invented on his own, because Grace said she could do figures well enough but not joyfully, and Martin said the same. And Samuel loved arithmetic with a passion that suggested a future that might take him somewhere different from the farm. And Martin and Grace talked about that privately with the particular mixture of pride and anticipatory loss that parents feel when they see their children forming lives that will eventually be their own. Clara grew into a girl who was more like Grace than either of them had initially recognized, not in appearance, because Clara had the Shepard gray-green eyes and a face that was uniquely her own, but in character, in the bedrock quality of her, the sense of being deeply planted in herself and in what she loved. She loved the farm. She loved the land. She was 15 and talking about crops with the seriousness of someone who was already thinking about what she would do with them. The 90s in Missouri were not easy for farmers. The economic pressures of that decade, the falling commodity prices and the railroad freight costs, and the debt burden that was crippling farms across the Middle States, touched the Shepard place too, though less badly than many, because Martin was conservative with money by temperament and Grace had grown up understanding that good years funded bad ones. They cut where they could and they managed, and they helped neighbors when they could afford to and asked for help when they needed it, and they came through without losing anything essential. In the summer of 1895, Martin turned 41 and Grace turned 37, and they had been married 13 years. And on the morning of their anniversary, which was the 22nd of November, Martin brought Grace her coffee and set it on the bedside table and sat on the edge of the bed and pulled the cedar box from the top dresser drawer. She looked at the box, still half asleep, and then she looked at him. He said he wanted to read her something. She sat up with her coffee and waited. He opened the box and found her first letter, the one addressed to Robert Aldridge, and he unfolded it carefully because the folds were worn soft, as Ida had observed so long ago from being opened and reread many times. He read it aloud to her in the early morning light of their bedroom, her words in his voice, and when he finished there was a long quiet. Grace said, "I sound so frightened." He said, "You sound brave. There is a difference." She took the letter from his hand and looked at it for a moment, at her own young handwriting in its careful leftward slant, and then she folded it gently along its worn creases and put it back in the box. She said, "I was writing to the wrong man." He said, "You were." She said, "It still found the right one." He said, "It did. Eventually." She set down her coffee cup and leaned across and kissed him, and it was a kiss with 13 years of certainty behind it, with the farm outside and the children asleep down the hall and the cedar box on the quilt between them, and the whole of a life that had grown from a misdirected letter and an honest answer. Samuel left for the university in Columbia in the autumn of 1898, a going that required the whole family to take the train and see him settled in his dormitory, which Samuel bore with the particular long-suffering patience of a 15-year-old, who was simultaneously proud that his parents cared and mortified that they were present. The ride back to Hannibal was quiet, and Grace sat with her hand in Martin's and looked out the window at the Missouri countryside in its autumn gold and brown, and said nothing for a long while. And Martin did not say anything either because, sometimes, There was nothing to say that was better than just being present in the feeling together. Clara was 12 that year and increasingly the focus of the farm's daily operation, following Grace through the work with a purposeful attention that went beyond childlike imitation into genuine learning. And Martin watched this with the particular satisfaction of seeing something come full circle. A woman teaching her daughter the things she herself had learned from her own mother, the knowledge of how to look at land and understand what it needed. By the turn of the century, 1900, Martin and Grace Shepard had been married 18 years, and the farm was in the best shape it had ever been. Martin had turned 45, and his dark hair had silver in it now, at the temples and scattered through, and Grace's dark hair had the same, and they had grown into the kind of couple that a community recognizes by a particular easy fluency with each other, the shorthand of long partnership, the way of moving through the same space that comes only from years of close daily knowledge. Samuel wrote from Columbia with the regularity and the particular mix of intellectual enthusiasm and practical complaint of a young man who was learning things he had not expected to find interesting, and finding the dormitory food a perennial disappointment. He was studying mathematics and showed every indication of continuing to do so with some professional purpose in mind. He wrote separately to his mother about the other students he had met, and separately to his father about the farm news in the Hannibal papers, which Martin had taken to clipping and posting to him. And these separate threads of correspondence made Martin smile privately, because it reminded him of something he understood very well, the particular clarity that comes from writing a thing down and sending it to someone you trust. Clara at 14 was spending as much time outdoors as she could manage during the school week and all of it on weekends, and she had developed an expertise in the Shepard farm's particular soil conditions that occasionally surprised even Grace. She had her father's physical steadiness and her mother's analytical mind, and the combination was formidable in a young person who was already thinking about what she wanted to do with her life. On a November afternoon in the year 1900, 18 years after the wedding and very close to the anniversary date, Martin came in from the south field where he and William Yates, who had stayed on and become as permanent a fixture of the farm as the water pump, had been clearing brush, and found Grace at the kitchen table with the cedar box open in front of her and the letters spread out, all of them, in the order they had been written, hers and his alternating in their two different hands. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and then at her. She said she was counting them. She said there were 23 letters in total between August and October of 1882 before he had come to Missouri, and she had been trying to remember which one had been the one where she had first understood that this was not a correspondence anymore, it was something more. He sat down across from her. She said, "Which one was it for you?" He said, "The third one." It was always the third one. She asked me a direct question in the third one, and I knew I could not stop. She picked up her third letter, the one she had written in July, and looked at it. The lavender blue ink still showed the brightness that good ink kept. The question she had asked was there near the bottom of the second page, and she read it silently. She said, "I was terrified when I wrote that." He said, "You told me." She said, "I keep saying that." He said, "Because it's still true, and I still think it was brave." She put the letter down and looked at him across the table, across the spread of their 23 letters and their 18 years, and said, "Do you know what I have thought about many times over these years?" He waited. She said, "I have thought about what would have happened if Hector at the post counter had sorted the mail correctly. If your letter had gone into the right pigeonhole and Robert Aldrich's name had been on the outside of that mail sack, and someone had forwarded it to wherever he had drifted to. I would have received no reply, or a dismissive one, and I would have been disappointed, and Ida would have been sympathetic, and eventually I would have either tried the advertisement again or given it up and stayed on this farm alone, which I was perfectly capable of doing, as you know." Martin said, "As I know." She said, "And you would have gone on at the Rocking S until Pete Calloway got too old to run it, and then you would have moved to some other ranch in some other county, and you would have kept saving your wages and looking at horizons. He said, "Probably." She said, "And the letters would have been mine, and they would have gone nowhere, and no one would have read them except a man who did not deserve them, and there would have been no cedar box and no farm and no Samuel in Columbia and no Clara in the South Field and no porch in the summer dark." He said, "But Hector did not sort the mail correctly." She said, "No, he did not." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. She said, "I am so glad you are a man who opens things," he said. "I am sorry I opened your letter," she said. "I am not. I have never been, not for a single day." She gathered the letters together carefully and put them back in the cedar box in order, the way she always put them back, and closed the lid, and he carried the box upstairs and put it in the top drawer of the dresser where it lived. And when he came back down, she was making supper, and Clara had come in from outside with mud on her boots and the smell of the autumn fields on her coat. And the kitchen was warm and full of the particular noise and light and smell of a home that was being lived in completely. And Martin Shepard stood in the doorway of his kitchen and looked at his wife and his daughter, and the cedar box upstairs and the farm outside, and the Missouri evening coming down blue and cold beyond the windows. The farm would be a good one for another generation, he thought. The land was well tended and the soil was deep, and Clara already knew everything Grace knew and was learning more. Samuel would go somewhere with his numbers and his mind, would build something different but equally his own, and he would come home for holidays, and the summer would fill with his voice and his opinions, and the whole house would be too small for him in the best possible way. Martin and Grace would grow old on this ground, he thought, in the way that people grew old when they had stopped moving and started being somewhere, putting down roots that went as deep as the soil would take them, becoming the kind of people who were known in a place, and who knew a place the way you could only know it after decades of daily attention. He thought about a Tuesday in 1882 in Dry Creek, Texas, and a man behind a post counter fumbling through the wrong pigeonhole, and a letter in a mail sack with dark blue ink, and a sprig of dried lavender pressed beneath the wax seal. He thought about lighting a lantern in a dark bunkhouse, and opening a letter that was not addressed to him, and reading 2 pages in a careful slanting hand, and finding something in those pages that had been sitting in his chest since Tuesday, as he had written to her, which was the most accurate thing he had ever put in writing and remained so 18 years later. The letter had been meant for another man. That man had not deserved it and would not have known what to do with it, and had never come back to collect it. Martin Shepard had opened it by mistake, and by the 3rd letter from Grace Graves he had been absolutely and entirely incapable of stopping, a condition that he had never recovered from and had no intention of trying to recover from. He walked into the kitchen and Grace turned from the stove and saw his face, the specific look on it, and she said, "What are you thinking about?" he said. "Hector and the wrong pigeonhole." She smiled the open smile. She said, "Again," he said, "always." She went back to the stove, and he came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back into him, and they stood in the warm kitchen, while Clara removed her muddy boots by the door, and complained that the pigs had been in the east fence again, and the evening came fully down over the Missouri farm, and the corn stubble in the winter field, and the river catching the last light in the distance, and the whole of a life that had been built from a misdirected letter, and an honest answer was present and accounted for, complete in every way that a life could be, settled and rooted and full, going on from this warm kitchen into whatever generous years remained, 2 people standing beside each other in the exact way that one of them had written about, and the other had read and understood completely and immediately, was exactly right. It was, by any reasonable accounting, the best error that Martin Shepard had ever made, and it was one he was grateful for every day of his life, every day that began with Grace's voice in the morning, and ended with the farm quiet around them, and the cedar box in the top drawer, and 23 letters between 2 people who had learned each other first on paper, and then in life, and had found in both places exactly what they were looking for.